Judge in Washington has blocked authorities from using the public health authority known as Title 42 to expel migrants from the U.S. The Trump administration used the policy in 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic as a way to control the spread of COVID-19. The Biden administration has since been using the policy to manage a wave of migration at the U.S.-Mexico border. For more on all of this, let's bring in CBS News immigration reporter Camilo Montoya-Galvez. Camilo, what does this mean in practical terms for U.S. border policy, this ruling?
Good evening, John. This is a major court ruling with significant implications on U.S. border enforcement and migration policy. Judge Emmett Sullivan of the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C. has blocked the Biden administration from expelling any migrant along the U.S.-Mexico border under Title 42. That is the public health law dating back to the late 19th century that was first invoked by the Trump administration at the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a CDC-authorized policy that is designed, at least from the government's perspective, to stop the spread of COVID-19 inside Border Patrol holding facilities. If this ruling is not suspended, John, it could very well pose significant operational challenges for the Biden administration, which has really relied on this policy to manage an unprecedented wave of migration along the U.S.-Mexico border over the past 2 years. In practical terms, most migrants will either have two processing pathways under this court ruling. Border officials will either have to detain them in holding facilities, or border officials will have to release migrants and instruct them to see a judge or an immigration official at a future court date. So that is the status quo. We know that the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice have asked Judge Emmett Sullivan to suspend this ruling for 5 months so they can gradually terminate Title 42, John.
So, Camilo, why did the judge make this ruling? Or what did he found? What was his reasoning behind it?
Well, Judge Emmett Sullivan, John, concluded that Title 42 is contrary to federal administrative law. He argued that this policy was not sufficiently explained and justified by the federal government. He argued that the CDC could have explored alternative policies such as vaccinations to process migrants and to mitigate COVID-19 concerns along the U.S.-Mexico border. He also said that the CDC failed to consider the harm that this policy could cause to migrants seeking asylum. He cited reports, John, of migrants being persecuted or otherwise victimized in Mexico and other places.
So that's interesting, Camilo. So, because back in April, didn't the Biden administration announce that Title 42 would be terminated because pandemic conditions had improved since the rule was enacted? But what this judge is saying is, forget about how COVID's doing or not doing, that the basic Title 42 shouldn't have been administered in the way it was. And if I could just tack on to that, do I have that right? And then secondarily, since the Biden administration wanted to do away with 42 anyway, are they going to fight this latest ruling in court?
Yes, the Justice Department, John, just filed a request with Judge Emmett Sullivan asking him to pause this ruling, in other words, for 5 weeks, so it can gradually terminate Title 42 and transition into regular immigration processing, which, as I mentioned earlier, John, requires officials to screen everyone who asks for asylum. And so that is the request that the Justice Department has made. But it could be argued, John, as you mentioned, that it is inconsistent with the CDC's stated policy back in April. They made a determination, John, that Title 42 was no longer necessary to protect public health and to curb the spread of the coronavirus. But a coalition of Republican-led states convinced another federal judge in Louisiana to block Title 42's termination.
So if I can just nail this down, Camilo, the Justice Department is asking for 5 weeks, but they're asking for 5 weeks to basically absorb the judge's ruling. They're not fighting the judge's ruling. They're not saying this was wrongly decided and we're going to appeal. They're saying we take your ruling and now it's just going to take us some time to accommodate the new reality that you've given us.
That's the case for now. That's the status quo, John. But the Justice Department could very well file an appeal and seek to have this court ruling overturned completely by an appellate court or the Supreme Court.
All right. Camilo Montoya-Galvez in Washington with all of the details. Thanks, Camilo.
Thanks, John.
There are now